Thank you, Manav. I'm truly moved by your introduction. I'm so glad also that you stopped short at appropriate times. There are stories about National Law School and my days there that I have chosen to forget, and I'm glad you did that too. Thank you, Romel, Lokesh, Timothy, and Karan for this deep honor. As you heard, I have been the founder of these lecture series. I did step away a couple of years ago. When I was asked to return as a speaker, I wondered if we would sound like the Congress party. But apparently that would happen only if I was to be made the lifetime patron. But I'm not fishing for it. I was not as reluctant to accept this invitation on that score though. My reluctance stems from the fact that my predecessors and seniors have set the bar so high that, to be honest, I'm inadequate. We've heard lectures of the last 18 years, and some of them have honestly been life-altering, about the DNA of the human race, about Aboriginal art, lectures about how honeybees have visual systems that are applied in avionics, about the vegan movement, and so on. And that was really my trepidation when I was asked to speak. But here I am. It's an honor to share this evening with so many veterans from the armed forces, my seniors from school, some of my classmates, juniors, friends from the OCA, from the OGA, my teachers. Mrs. Sequeira, I'm seeing after, 38 years, Mrs. Khurshid, Mrs. Sani, Mrs. Matthew, Mrs. Naeem, Mr. Iqbal Ahmed, a friend and a mentor, Mr. Shankar, my principal, Dr. Samuel, how good it is to see you, sir, Dr. Ebenezer, the former principal, Dr. Christopher, Mrs. Franklin. And I am personally overjoyed that Mr. and Mrs. Kaur are with us from Calcutta, or just Ma and Baba, for the want of a better description. My adopted parents, if I may say. Ma has been a teacher for many years at La Martiniere, Calcutta. She then moved to Modern High School as the principal. And she and all my teachers here today prove that the old school teachers never age. They look the same. Mrs. Sequeira looks the same as she did 40 years ago. My photograph, Manav, in the shots, clearly there's a difference. Not with our teachers. It's good to see Belly, my friend, the General's grandson. This was a lecture series we started with his parents in confidence. We miss them this evening, but hopefully in the future they will join us. C.N. Kumar, my co-trustee and now an executive patron. Former trustees, Rajiv, Jairaj, Kiran, Ashwin, Prashant, I don't know if you're here. Comrades and friends, amigos, as you said, with whom we tried to build this little institution. Friends from Koshis, friends from the bar, senior council. Basically everybody who intimidates me is here this evening. To Air Vice Marshal Uport, my heartiest congratulations on the medal, sir. You mentioned Air Marshal Mally Wallen, who's been a patron at these lectures. I must share with you, we were having dinner, must be 15, 18 years ago, when you were probably a wing commander or a group captain. And I asked Air Marshal Wallen, I said, sir, are there any old boys serving in the Air Force? He thought about it for a second, and then in his typical style, he said, Aditya, Uport is a good chap. And that's so true. And it's a deep honor for me, sir, to be speaking at this function today alongside your receiving this medal. Traditionally, these lectures always happen on campus. As you heard, I would have certainly liked to speak at that beautiful campus at Cotton's, but I realized that circumstances don't permit it. The trustees took a position. Karan hinted at it when he spoke of the independence of the trust. They took a position on the unceremonious suspension of the principal, Dr. Christopher, who's here with us today, and that probably alienated them from the establishment. But to muster on the side of right is what our school song taught us, and principle trumps nostalgia every single day. I dare say also, friends, that this may be a coming of age moment for the lecture series. Though we went to school 70 years apart, it feels like I've known General Thimayya personally, not only having worked on these lectures, but having studied his life closely as well. He was a many-hued personality, a warrior and a peacekeeper, a negotiator and an enforcer, a leader and a soldier's general, playful but ramrod straight, one who stood up to senior bullies in school and to political bullies in office, had the moral courage to put in his papers as chief, only to be talked out of it by the then Prime Minister, somebody who had an international persona and an almost dreamlike career in the Indian Army. General Thimayya never lost his connect with Coorg, with Bangalore or Cottons. Legend has it that he would salute the school when he drove past it in his entourage, and would actually wait at the warden's gate to be invited in for a cup of tea. The warden then, of course, was the incomparable wheelchair-bound Reverend I.L. Thomas, who is frankly irreplaceable. That caliber of wardens, of teachers, and of alumni really, I believe, are the people who helmed the school and its legacy over the years that we seek to celebrate as part of these lectures. And it is therefore a deep and a joyous honor for me to be invited to deliver the 18th General Thimayya Memorial Lecture. I have one anecdote of General Thimayya's before I move to my talk for this evening, courtesy Mr. Vijay Padaki. I don't know if Mr. Padaki is here. I'm delighted that Mr. Chiranjeev Singh is with us. Apparently in the 1960s, the General was invited to Bangalore Club by some friends to be part of what was curiously called the Empire Loyalist Society. And when God Save the Queen was played, General Thimayya refused to stand for the anthem. Now I'm pretty certain that this cost him his membership at this society, but knowing him, he couldn't care less. Historically, officers of the services were exempt from standing for the national anthem in Britain because their loyalty was beyond question. But this, I think, was Timmy just being Timmy, with his finger on the pulse and the ability to make a statement nonchalantly. And it's therefore very uplifting that we celebrate his memory as part of these lectures today. The idea of India is a phrase attributed to Professor Sunil Khilnani from his eponymous book of 1997. I noticed that he begins his book with a chapter called The Ideas of India, suggesting straight off the bat that the idea of India is not monochromatic, but plural and multiple. But it is nevertheless an idea, a concept, which is the essence of understanding the spirit of a nation. He quotes Rabindranath Tagore to say, "A country is not territorial, but ideational." Beautiful words from someone who saw nationalism as humanism. The book looks at things that people had to say about India as a political entity historically. For instance, John Strachey in 1885 condescendingly commented, "There never was an India possessing, according to European ideas, any sort of unity, physical, political, social, or religious, nor a nation, nor a people of India, of which we hear so much." Now, this position has provoked multiple reactions, especially in the 1920s, as to how India was in fact identifiable as a religious, caste-based, and even a cultural monolith. Each proposition that has its own inadequacies. Some argue that our village systems and princely states were based on rule of law and hence had the essence of a constitution. Some look at the Government of India Act of 1935 as a constitution of sorts. But we're really clutching at straws here. The adoption of the Constitution on November 26, 1949, and it's coming into force 2 months later on what we celebrate as Republic Day, really then was the singular moment when the holistic idea of India was set in stone. As Granville Austin described it, the Constitution as the cornerstone of our nation. We did not simply gain independence, sworn to democracy, but quickly evolved into being a republic, defined, governed, and administered by a living constitution, where Ambedkar's dream of one person, one value, and not just one person, one vote, was sought to be codified. This process is liberating. In one of my recent podcasts, and I do a podcast called The Podcast, CASTE, which are really conversations around caste, I was speaking to Siddhesh Gautam, who's colloquially known as Bakery Prasad. He's an artist. He told me that the adoption of the Constitution represents a moment of magic, his words, and of emancipation, because it gave recognition to the rights of the oppressed classes, who otherwise, as he says, would simply move from one master to another. That is the power of a constitution. To borrow from Victor Hugo, this was an idea whose time had come. The Constitution begins with the words, India, that is Bharat. And one has to give due weightage to the use of this word. It is one question as to what the idea of Bharat is. And that perhaps will take us down a civilizational expedition. But the fact is there existed an amorphous concept of Bharat, a bit like Charles de Gaulle, the French president, who proclaimed to have a certain idea of France, prone to many versions, evolving over time. But it is really the Constitution that recognized, defined, and built upon this. It is not to say that our Constitution was the inception of the idea of India, but it is most certainly a watershed in crystallizing that idea. The Constituent Assembly debates show the vigorous conceptual negotiation that took place in this regard. Those who criticize our Constitution as being some foreign colonial document must realize that this is a Constitution that borrows from the best in the world. Importantly, to me, it shrugs off the colonial influence, as the UK has never had a written constitution. That's a conscious distancing from the hangover of empire. We have traditionally followed English common law. There are many lawyers here in the audience and could have been tempted to follow the English model of having no written constitution but simply a set of traditions and customs. Whose traditions and customs would those be that we follow? I believe that the purposeful election of a written constitution that has many streaks of American constitutionalism and many that are organic to us and belong to our milieu suggests that in 1949 we chose to be our own people, to posture our independence and to uplift our own. Kumud Pawade, who was one of the first Dalit teachers in Sanskrit, at her Sanskrit Pandita Award ceremony, is quoted in Veena Venugopal's book, Independence Day, A People's History, as saying, I am a woman, a Dalit, and married to a Shudra. In all three cases, I should not learn or teach Sanskrit according to the Shastras. But the constitution of my India allows me to do this. That is the idea of India. The preamble to the Constitution gives us a unique architecture for India, and I am carrying a shiny version with me. My colleagues will tell you how worn out my actual original version of the Constitution is. And I'd like you to imagine this architecture, friends. A foundation that is sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic, and republic, upon which are built 4 floors. The floors of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity, each with rooms of their own. Justice, social, economic, and political. Liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship. Equality of status and of opportunity. And fraternity that rooms the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. I think pictorially, a beautiful structure. The legislature is in some sense meant to be the designer of this building, if you will, who can certainly imagine and even reimagine the structure, but without doing damage to its basic features. The executive could be seen as the workforce who implement this design, meant to do that job with honest intent so as to sustain both the intent of the designer as also of the original blueprint. The judiciary, and I will talk about this in the course of my lecture, could be seen as the sentinel or the supervisor of this architecture so as to ensure that none of the players cross those lines and that the integrity of the Constitution remains. The legal community to which many of us belong, the media, activists, and civil society at large would represent the floodlights or the CCTVs that continue to cast light upon the goings-on in these premises. This architecture is given to us by ourselves. It is we, the people of India, giving ourselves the gift of a sacred social contract as developers, as conceivers, as co-owners, as inhabitants, and importantly, as protectors. That is the idea of India. Akash Singh Rathore, in his recent book, argues that Ambedkar was not just the architect of the Constitution, but indeed the verbatim author of the preamble. And the preamble is the soul of the Constitution, if I may. I learn of a pending PIL to strike out the words secularism and socialism from its text on the ground that they were never contained in the original preamble. Does striking them out mean we are not socialist and secular? While the debate on socialism may certainly be on, but secularism is in fact the preamble of not just our Constitution, but I believe of our very DNA. The days we spent in school that we spoke of, oblivious of religion, of differences of class, of caste, perhaps too ignorant, I would say, in some senses, but that defines to me what it meant to be Cottonian, Bangalorean, and Indian. The spirit of fraternity, equality, the idea of merit, the idea of respect for religion, the emphasis on being and doing good and doing the right thing. Cliches perhaps, but things that have stayed with us. Enjoying the liberty to think and express oneself, except when Dr. Samuel was in the vicinity, were indeed part of the personality of growing up here in the 1980s. That liberty sadly did not extend to forays to the girls' school, and many of us are still scarred from that denial. In his 1850 book titled simply The Law, and this little booklet was given to me by my classmate Ajit Mutanna, I don't know if Ajit is here, Frederick Bastiat, the French philosopher, concludes, and now that legislatures and do-gooders have so futilely inflicted so many systems upon society, may they end where they should have begun. May they reject all systems and try liberty. For liberty is an acknowledgement of faith in God and his works. This he said as far back as 1850. But for us, friends, liberty is at the core of our Constitution. We are inherently meant to be liberated as a species, are we not? I can do well to quote Shelley from his Ode to Liberty, which was my 7th standard elocution piece when Mrs. Sebastian was my Pakenham Walsh House teacher, incidentally, a vice marshal. I was trained by my senior Raj Bagaria, and these words came back to me literally 30 odd years later. Of course, I had to Google them for exactitude. Frowning over the tempestuous sea of kings and priests and slaves in tower-crowned majesty, that multitudinous anarchy did sweep and burst around their walls like idle foam, whilst from the human spirit's deepest deep, strange melody with love and awe struck dumb, dissonant arms, and art which cannot die, with divine wand traced on our earthly home, fit imagery to pave heaven's everlasting dome. A fitting tribute to the idea of liberty, which I believe runs in our veins. Equally, as Paulo Freire describes conscientizacao, which is a fear of freedom, an attachment to the status quo and therefore the fear of change. There are those who enjoy the status quo of the balance of power. In contrast, there are those, which he says, who do not claim to be the proprietors of history or the liberators of the oppressed, but simply who commit to fight at their side to enable the freedom of others. What advocates do in many ways. Freedom is therefore tangible and elusive all at once. The American civil rights activist John Lewis, in his memoir Across That Bridge, says, and Akar Patel quotes him recently in a piece, freedom is not a state, it is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Freedom is the continuous action we all must take, and each generation must do its part to create an even more fair, more just society. What a beautiful clarion call from John Lewis. The arm wrestle, therefore, friends, for liberty is therefore a play in many acts with many actors. And it is often, not just in India, but worldwide, to be struggled and fought for. After all, didn't we collectively fight for our independence? Did not the Constitution give recognition to exactly this fight that I allude to today? Guru Gobind Singh, in his Zafarnama, or Epistle of Victory, written in Farsi to Aurangzeb after the Battle of Chamkaur in 1705, has these stirring lines to offer. Chunkar az hama hilat e dar guzasht, halal ast burdan bi shamsher dast. In translation, courtesy Navtej Sarna, when all has been tried, yet justice is not in sight, it is then right to pick up the sword. It is then right to fight. While the Guru perhaps meant this in a martial sense, there is a metaphor to the sword in our Constitution, and that is Article 32. The right to move the Supreme Court for enforcement of fundamental rights. Some of you will already know, some will be amazed to know, is in itself a fundamental right to constitutional remedies. What Ambedkar said was the heart of the Indian Constitution, the sword, if you will, that citizens pick up to fight the persecution of the state in all its avatars. And that is what keeps justice in sight and casts a heavy burden upon the courts as the arbiter of these precious rights. Of course, the practitioners here will bear me out. The Supreme Court has often chosen not to entertain petitions under Article 32, preferring to relegate petitioners to their respective high courts, perhaps because of the docket explosion that we face in India. But this merely shifts the list from Delhi to elsewhere. But the essence of the proceedings, the essence of the fight for justice, for liberty does not change. This pursuit of liberty through the sword of justice is at the heart of our Constitution. This is the idea of India. Our Constitution, in fact, mandates duties alongside rights. Takes me back to my civics class in Standard 11. This duty includes a fundamental duty to abide by the Constitution, to respect its ideals, to respect the flag, the national anthem. For every right that we speak of is a corresponding duty. For the right to liberty and expression is the duty to uphold and protect the sovereignty and integrity of India. For the right to religion is the duty to promote harmony and the spirit of brotherhood. For the right to freedom of trade and occupation is the duty to protect and improve our natural environment and to have compassion for living creatures. For the right to liberty and freedom of thought is the duty to develop a scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry. For the right to autonomy and to live a life of one's choosing comes the duty to strive towards excellence in all spheres of collective activity, so the nation constantly rises to higher levels of endeavor and achievement. For every right, a corresponding duty. That is the idea of India. This right-duty access, friends, extends even to the state. For all the powers that the state enjoys, the Constitution, by the directive principles, of state policy enjoins it to strive to promote an order, and this is a beautiful conception, in which justice, social, economic, and political informs all our institutions, that the state strives to minimize inequalities in income, that it provides an equal right to livelihood for men and women, and I would now say other genders, to distribute the ownership and control of material resources, socialism, if you will, equal pay for equal work, a legal system that promotes justice with legal aid. I know personally how important that is. A living wage and a decent standard of life, the need to encourage cottage industry and culture. Interestingly, to have a uniform civil code, and some of you will be aghast to introduce prohibition of liquor, to promote the interests of the weaker sections, especially scheduled castes and tribes, protect the environment, its forests and wildlife, protect its heritage and the artistic historical monuments, to promote international peace, and to separate the judiciary from the executive. What a marvelous mandate to the state. Not strictly enforceable, I concede, but a strong value system that ought to be the conscience of our state. When I say state, I mean the center, the states, the governments that govern us. And value systems that the courts have from time to time read into our jurisprudence. This is not dead letter. Directive principles have been applied and invoked by the courts oftentimes to try and develop the law, to march the law forward. And this, to me, in the letter of our Constitution, is a vibrant exposition of what the nation must look like from the eyes of an ideal state, and how it must endeavor to build this beautiful, breathing monument. Perhaps utopian, but an aspirational idea of India. Emperor Akbar had the Ramayana and Mahabharata translated into Persian and shared them widely. This should remind us of our sense of plurality. We are one because we are different. United without being the same, a union of states, federal and diverse, complex and various in our ways. A fine indicator of our diversity is language. The reorganization of states in 1956 came about on a linguistic basis, eroding the hitherto bifurcation between princely states and governors' provinces, which really didn't reflect who we were as a people, which paid no heed to the linguistic identity of Indians at large. Potti Sriramulu, also known as Amarjeevi, or immortal for his fast unto death that led to the creation of Andhra Pradesh, carved out from the hitherto Madras presidency, showed that language and culture trump politics. Professor G.N. Devi aptly points out that Hindi is spoken mainly only in Himachal, Uttarakhand, UP, Rajasthan, Bihar, Jharkhand, MP and Chhattisgarh. That's 8 out of our 29 states. And even there, he points out, oftentimes contrary to public perception, as a second language, while native languages are still the languages of choice but are fast disappearing. Article 343 of our Constitution recognizes Hindi as the official language, but simultaneously provides for English to be the overriding official language till such time legislation provides otherwise. The imposition of Hindi has been strongly resisted, especially in our southern states. E.V. Ramaswamy, better known as Periyar, was one such trenchant opponent of language imposition. Asked in 1930 whether India was a single country, he responded dismissively saying, no, India was just a collection of various castes, religions, and languages. It is the Constitution 20 years later that I believe unified us into one. The Constitution does not speak of a national language, perhaps keeping in mind that India speaks a whopping 447 languages, of which the 8th schedule lists 22. One of these is Hindi. The list of 22 includes Sindhi, the language of a people without a state, and Urdu, the language of a people of all states. That is the idea of India. Ms. Mrinal Pandey the eminent journalist who has recently published a book on the journey of Hindi journalism in India, comments that though Hindi has expanded in terms of its usage over the past decades, its soul has shrunk. These are her words. And Hindi does have a soul. One is reminded of Prime Minister Vajpayee's speeches in Parliament as being almost poetic with those pregnant pauses that he took. But now language has assumed a political avatar, as has food and culture. The political avatar of language actually is not alien to us, in the sense that some of the strongest writing that emerged in the wake of emergency was really in Hindi. The journals Dharamyudh, Saptahik, Hindustan, and others stood tall at that time. Arunav Sinha says poignantly, though, that translation is the language of democracy. Translation is the language of democracy. If India has to walk together, we must talk to and understand each other and voraciously translate regional languages into each other. Language, region, and culture are paramount indicators of identity, friends. In referring to the Sindhis earlier, I was really referring to the status of migrants in general and partition migrants in particular. Ours is a Punjabi family. My father was a partition migrant. Mr. Singh spoke in his memory earlier this year poignantly and evocatively about Bangalore and the partition. My father's side moved from Quetta, my mother's side from Lahore. Having been born in Bangalore, I have over the last few years perhaps begun to wonder more about my own identity. I'm as North Indian as Rishi Sunak is Indian. Our predicament is that of Andre, the protagonist in Florian Zeller's stirring play, The Height of the Storm. Confronted with the debilitating crossroads in his life, Andre asks viscerally at one point in the script, there must be some sense to all this, isn't there? If not, what is my position? What is my position here? What is my position? My position, what is my position here? My position here, what is it? My position, what is it? I hope you will permit me a little self-indulgence. I believe I'm more Kannadiga than Punjabi, entirely South Indian, but dividing time in Delhi, thinking in English with Bangalore as the only native place. Now that is an identity crisis, if there was one. But this is where I have personally found that I am defined by two things, cottons and the Constitution. They give me an identity that transcends the narrow domestic walls that Tagore spurns in seeking that heaven of freedom, as he says, into which our country can awake. I'm reminded of what Canon Elphick had said at the cusp of independence, at a point in time when perhaps good old Christian schools may have been vulnerable. And he said almost prophetically that he believed that these schools had a paramount role to play in the future greatness of India. And how true that is. Look at many of our stalwarts here who've perhaps been through that process with the identity crises that I speak of, but nevertheless grounded in being Indian and contributing to this larger greatness that we speak of. And therefore, this is an India of plurality, of tolerance, of humanism. In that sense, the Constitution gives many of us an identity. It is therefore in itself, I feel, the idea of being Indian. Ashoka the Great converted to Buddhism in the 3rd century BC, as did Ambedkar over 2000 years later, though for very different reasons. Ashoka grew to abjure violence, and his life offers a message today. Society at large is growing increasingly violent with reducing respect for the rule of law, with the diminishing tolerance of the rights and space of others. Violence does violence to the spirit of a constitution. The Edict Project of Ashoka University in collaboration with the musician activist T.M. Krishna, is in fact seeking to reiterate the principles of this great king, Ashoka. There is one from the 12th Rock Edict, circa 250 BC, that is referred to in Alan Seeley's book, which has stayed with me. It says, "Watch your tongue, glorify your own faith, and you do it harm. Praise other faiths, don't slight them. Mix with others, learn from them. This way you honor your own faith and benefit every other." Beautiful, simple words, reminiscent of Patanjali's Sutra. It is fitting that Seeley's book is called Ashoka, a Sutra. I wonder what Ashoka would have felt about the snarling lions that are now mounted over Parliament. I learned that a PIL was filed claiming that they violated the National Emblems Act, trust someone to come up with a legal argument, and was dismissed by the Supreme Court, observing orally that their aggression is a matter of perception. Now, some might say that this represents a new India that is assertive and will not be bulldozed, the attitude that Virat Kohli brought to the cricket field as captain, often snapping and cursing in the name of leadership. I should go easy, I believe it's his birthday today. And his 82 against Pakistan was a work of art. But others may rue the vanishing pacifist Gandhian, or should I say Dravidesque, stoicism that gave India pride of place, for an ideology that was hitherto rare and untested, especially at a time when the world was at war for the second time, the idea of ahimsa. My senior Philip Wallen spoke so eloquently about the idea of ahimsa at the 4th Thimayya lecture. And I would like to think that this, the latter, is more the idea of India. Our constitution is in many ways Sufi, in the sense that it permits for all religion. I don't say this in a religious sense at all, but is embedded in being righteous, spiritual, and good, but not aligned with religion itself, for whom conscience trumps religion. Rumi in the Masnavi, in translation by Javed Mojadadi, says that while the warriors stand to the king's left and the treasurer and scribes to his right, the Sufis are seated straight in front as they serve as mirrors to the soul. In other words, my Cottonian buddies will like this, they sit neither to the right nor to the left. But our constitution, therefore, is a mirror to our soul. And we may choose, if we so like, to behold in it all that's good and right, what we perhaps refer to as constitutional morality that ought to guide our mothership forward. Justice Edwin Cameron of the South African Supreme Court, who was openly gay and was hailed by Nelson Mandela as a modern hero of South Africa, has these wise words to offer in his memoirs, Justice, a Personal Account. He says, "The Constitution's commitment to diversity is not rooted in sentimentality. It is based in sound political and social calculation. It is true that tolerance and acceptance foster human well-being. They create good feelings. But diversity is not only about warm feelings. It is rooted," he says, "in hard-nosed conceptions of essential public interest. We have to tolerate and celebrate our differences as people so that we can thrive economically and culturally and intellectually, both materially and spiritually," he says. "Diversity is good for us." That, he says, is the most fundamental lesson of South Africa's commitment to rule of law and constitutionalism, which I believe we ought to admire and replicate. Noting that the Constitution of South Africa pledges to transform it from a country built on racist and racial triumphalism to one where discrimination was prohibited and where dignity of all was fostered. And I believe they have certainly in South Africa, based on this constitutional spirit, been able to take giant strides in that direction. I had occasion to refer to the judgment of the Durban High Court in Sunali Pillai's case, in the ongoing hijab case in which I appear. And in that case, the South African court recognized the right of a Hindu girl to wear a nose stud to school based simply on her cultural beliefs. That paradigm is being tested as we speak. In some ways, the hijab matter is becoming symbolic of the ideas of India, the multiple ideas of India, as demonstrated by two starkly differing views of the Constitution on the bench. Justice Chinnappa Reddy, who was a liberal and a forward-looking judge of our Supreme Court in Bijoy Emanuel's case, which is the landmark case where Jehovah's Witnesses were permitted to remain standing during our national anthem, but not necessarily sing it because of their faith. He concluded his judgment with these lines: "We only wish to add, our tradition teaches tolerance, our philosophy preaches tolerance, our constitution practices tolerance. Let us not dilute it." And tolerance is really nothing new to Cottonians and Josephites. We've been tolerating each other for 150 years plus now. It's part of our ethos. But more seriously, I want to say it's a pleasure to see friends from St. Joseph's Boys High School here. I have long believed that we need to have a common platform to ideate. I think that will bring good energy to the city we love. I even thought of a name for it. We could call it the Wagah border. Beware, there may be fire. Tolerance and secularism is in itself now reduced in some ways to tokenism, I'm afraid. It was, I think, the actor Mohanlal, I'm not sure, who said that earlier going over to a Muslim friend's house on Eid was friendship. Now it is secularism. We have now made society conscious of these identities that were earlier our glue and have in some ways now become our Achilles heel. When Ashdeep drops a catch, he's Sikh. When Shami goes for runs, he's Muslim. That is not the idea of India. Permit me a wistful Punjabi verse here. Bule Shah chal uthe chaliye jithe sare hovan anne, na koi sadi zaat pachane, na koi sannu mane. Bule Shah, let us go to that haven where everyone is blind to our caste and where none is blindly revered. What a aspirational thought. But in some ways, I think, friends, it's easier to define what is not the idea of India. Just as you know, using sandpaper on the ball is not cricket unless you're Steve Smith, fake encounters by policemen in the name of justice is not the idea of India. I see so many brave and gallant veterans. My friend Casey is here, who's a Veer Chakra. I'm sure there are many others here who represent the pride of the Indian Armed Forces. And I'm sure you squirm, friends, at the thought of celebrating the idea of killing somebody in cold blood, and that too in uniform, being celebrated by society as an act of valor. We do this as we speak. We saw that in Hyderabad. The remission of Bilkis Bano's rape accused and then garlanding them as heroes is not the idea of India. Lynching mentally challenged individuals by branding them child lifters is not the idea of India. Believing in rank superstition, human sacrifice and discrimination, and ironically killing rationalists is not the idea of India. The beating and even killing of a Dalit boy for trying to drink water from a common pot is not the idea of India. Running JCBs through slums in the name of law and order or urban planning is not the idea of India. Incessant farmer suicides, which P. Sainath writes so movingly about while we boast of being an economic superpower, is not the idea of India. Foisting charges of sedition on an officer who prevents a political leader from entering the ATC of an airport for trying to force a flight after hours is not the idea of India. Having our fellow citizens indulge in manual scavenging, a glorified metaphor for removing excreta from our drains, this in the name of employment is not the idea of India. The idea of India is not the idea of a government or of a high-powered elite. What the commonest of our citizens aspires for as a haven of compassion and opportunity where dignity pervades. That is the idea of India. Justice Benjamin Cardozo, that great jurist of the American Supreme Court, had said, "A constitution states or ought to state not rules for the passing hour, but principles for an expanding future. Insofar as it deviates from that standard and descends into detail and particulars, it loses its flexibility. The scope of interpretation contracts, the meaning hardens. While it is true to its function, it maintains its power of adaptation, its suppleness, its play." That is when he says it is true to its function. That play, friends, is the strength of our Constitution. Its ability to be interpreted to meet the justice of the time. The rights to privacy, General Wambatkere is here, dignity, autonomy, sexuality, bodily integrity, ecology, and many others are not rights that you find expressly in our Constitution. These are rights that have been read into the right to life. It surprises me sometimes to see folks read the Constitution as though it was some municipal corporation's legislation, without its elasticity or its imagination. We, friends, have come a long way. If I took pride in commending the South African model, I take great pride in commending the Indian jurisprudence over the last 40 to 50 years. We have come a long way from the dark jurisprudence of ADM Jabalpur, where the Supreme Court upheld the absolute suspension of fundamental rights on the shallow ground of emergency powers. In other words, a police officer could shoot anyone dead on the street, but you would have no legal remedy simply because emergency was in play. We have moved past that jurisprudence in leaps and bounds. And therefore, I feel personally that constitutional courts need never feel helpless, as the letter and spirit of the Constitution gives them, as Justice Cardozo says, the adaptation, the suppleness, the play that is needed to further civil rights and the idea of justice, driven, I dare say, by the notion of constitutional morality. Justice Kennedy in Boumediene versus Bush, which was a habeas corpus case of an individual held in military detention at the Guantanamo Bay, came down on the US government with strong words. He said the nation's basic charter cannot be contracted away like this. The Constitution grants the Congress and the President the power to acquire, dispose of, and govern territory, not the power to decide when and where its terms apply. To hold that the political branches may switch the Constitution on or off at will would lead to a regime in which they, and not this court, say what the law is. A strong admonition to any government that ultimately the arbiter of the law is and ought to be the Supreme Court. Ram Guha, I believe, had once said that the idea of India is bigger than the nation of India, while the idea of Pakistan is smaller than the nation of Pakistan. In the course of my research for my PhD, and I'm delighted that my PhD guide, Dr. Asadi, is here today all the way from Mysore. Thank you, sir. I found in my research that the institutional imbalances in Pakistan have led to the subversion of democracy. Had its Supreme Court played a more active role, and had its army played a less politically active role, its history would have been dramatically different. And remember, Pakistan got its constitution in 1956, a crucial 6 years after us, by which time martial law was already there to stay. This is where, friends, I want to emphasize the need to acknowledge the serious role that institutions play in any constitutional framework, especially ours, in being a proud liberal democracy. Granville Austin, some may challenge that though, Granville Austin had described the Indian Supreme Court as a proxy opposition in the late 70s after this dark emergency jurisprudence that I referred, which he said was a role that the Supreme Court played in the absence of a potent political opposition. But I pay tribute here, friends, not just to active institutions such as the Supreme Court, the bureaucracy, the media to an extent, and others that have kept our constitutional ship afloat, but to passive institutions such as the armed forces. And I share this with friends here from the armed services that have kept away from politics. The reasons for that are completely different. I don't intend to digress into that conversation, but I do believe that less credit is given to the Indian Army and the armed forces for having kept away from political adventurism, which in the early decades of our country created democratic space for us to grow. The early years and the early decades of a country can be crucial when young democracies are vulnerable, and I think that passive institutions that do nothing are critically important to the idea of India. When I say do nothing, I mean soldiers who remain professional soldiers and keep out of politics. Officers like General Thimayya, who stayed away from politics, though politics never really stayed away from them. This, I believe, led to the development and evolution of an idea of India. As much as we celebrate, friends, the idea of constitutionalism, we ought to be conscious that constitutions have their own limitations. Justice Cameron speaks of what he calls the two schools of thought. Those who feel a constitution does too much and takes away from the agency of the people, and those who feel that a constitution does too little to make a change to the social politics of the time. There is truth in both. It is typically governments that believe that the constitution does too much. I saw that in my role as the Additional Advocate General, especially in a rights-based constitution such as ours. The directive principles that cast this heavy duty that I spoke of are in many ways the conscience of the constitution, but can impede undemocratic efforts of the state. And this churn is on globally. Chile recently held a plebiscite to jettison the Pinochet constitution in favor of one that was plural and liberal, but the reform was defeated. The US Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade, as you know, and reverted to an era where abortion was illegal and opposed to scripture, subject to what the respective states may do. I hear that it is likely now to reverse the policy of race-based admissions in colleges in the US as well. I happen to be appearing for the petitioners in a PIL in the Karnataka High Court, which challenges the anti-conversion law, intriguingly called the Right to Freedom of Religion Bill. The courts, therefore, friends, are at the forefront of this societal churn. The Indian Supreme Court has over decades of jurisprudence assumed to itself the right to inherently interpret and enforce, and some would say even redraft, the Constitution. That is what in common parlance we refer to as judicial activism. The constructs of the collegium system for appointment of judges and the basic structure doctrine, which limit the powers of amendment, are interestingly both judge-made principles. And here I find that the two most central tenets of our Constitution, that is the basic structure doctrine and the collegium system of appointment of judges, which is really judges who decide whether an amendment is within the basic structure, are judges who are appointed by a process which itself is the creation of judge-made law. No wonder then that governments are often up in arms against this form of constitutionalism, but I think this represents a unique illustration of constitutional plumbing to maintain a fine balance in a country as diverse and complex as ours, keeping in mind the gross abuse that one often sees in appointing and promoting judges, which we saw during the emergency, and I believe we continue to see. Ironically, even with the collegium system, judges often suffer injustice when it comes to their own career progression. I won't take names, but you know who I speak of. And this is owed to a dominant executive. But equally, it is to be highlighted that the Indian Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. And therefore, the idea of India, in many ways, is defined and prone to be defined by the judiciary. No conversation on this concept can be concluded without emphasizing this role that the courts play. And as a sequitur, to emphasize the method of appointing judges to the higher judiciary. I will be speaking at the Kerala High Court next week on the invitation of the bar on the future of the basic structure doctrine, where I will attempt to flesh out some of these concepts in greater detail. But I will leave you with the pithy words of Justice Robert Jackson of the US Supreme Court, who said in 1953, "We are not final because we are infallible. We are infallible because we are final." That, I believe, friends, puts a great onus on the role that our judges play. I'm conscious that I have taken much time, but permit me a few more minutes to close out some concepts that I have thought through. Please bear with me as I do that. The Indian Constitution is the most lengthy and most amended constitutions in the world. I have spoken of its limitations. I have spoken of amendment. There have been some unwarranted, some unconstitutional amendments. The establishment of the National Judicial Appointments Commission was struck down by the Supreme Court as being opposed to the basic structure. But equally, there have been steps forward, progressive steps forward that we have taken by virtue of the amendment of our Constitution. For example, the right to education that we cherish was introduced by way of the insertion of Article 21A, which I believe has been a game changer. I must say that the judgment of the Supreme Court in Rajasthan Unaided Schools Association case, which excludes private unaided minority schools from the purview of the RTE, I believe dilutes the effect of that law, if I'm permitted to say this with all respect. I feel that schools such as ours, Bishop Cotton, would have done well to have students from the RTE quota study alongside other pupils. But similar amendments, the insertion of Article 371J, which provides for reservation to folks from the Hyderabad, Karnataka region, I think is a unique constitutional construct. It recognizes the backwardness of certain districts and geographies in the country and provides for their advancement through affirmative action. Similar provisions are available in the Northeast as well. I had the privilege, in fact, as the Additional Advocate General in Karnataka, to defend a series of executive orders that came to be issued to implement the provisions of Article 371J. I believe it does represent the march of the law. The 42nd Amendment, which provided for grassroots representation, what we call the panchayat system, I think is also something we need to talk about sometime. It introduces a Gandhian form of governance which is decentralized, in contrast to what Nehru and Ambedkar saw as being a more centralized power structure. I think it represents an accommodation in our constitution that we ought to be proud of. Of course, this tug of war, what we loosely call federalism, is what really oftentimes challenges the courts. There is a pull, not just politically, but in terms of jurisdiction, in terms of legitimacy of statutes, in terms of the availability of finances and budgeting, that creates this friction between the states and the center, as we've seen with the Aam Aadmi Party and BJP in our national capital. And again, courts are at the forefront of this process of adjudication. The ship of Theseus, friends, represents a paradox where many elements are introduced so as to replace the original design, where one begs the question as to which is the real ship. Is it the arrangement of the new parts or the remnants of the old ones? But I wouldn't take that analogy to its logical end with our constitution. I would compare our constitution to the Mahabharata in the sense that that is a text that has received multiple interpretations, returning to a central theme of duty and morality. That flexibility, I feel, friends, is more appealing and acceptable. These amendments show that the Indian Constitution is supple enough to be able to better represent the needs and aspirations of its generations. That is the idea of India. I read recently of a draft constitution, and I am coming to the end, I promise, by a Swamiji, which conceives of a Hindu Rashtra, where Muslims and Christians, he proposes, will also enjoy all rights of a common citizen, barring the right to vote. And everything, the gentleman says, will be conducted on the basis of the Varna system. Now, Dr. M.P. Raju, a scholar and a lawyer, has responded to this maneuver by saying that the Indianization of our constitution cannot become an agenda of supremacist cultural homogenization. Pardon me. That is not the idea of India. A senior counsel in the High Court, whom I won't name, jokingly said, "It seems these days the constitution is unconstitutional." I do personally feel that the constitution is not under threat, but I believe it's under challenge. I have scarcely seen it be questioned as much as I have in the recent past. And I therefore want to say, friends, that more than ever before, we need to take pride in our constitution, to stand by it, to engage with it, and not be apologists for it. That onus is on all of us gathered here today. It's not just upon those who work with the constitution in a literal sense. Of course, there is need to change, and there is room for improvement. It was Saint Basavana's Vachana that said, "Sthava rakali untu, janga makali villa. Things standing shall perish, but the moving shall always stay. But just as long as the baby does not get flung out with the bath water." One of the most interesting cases that I have done in my career as a counsel was seeking the recognition and regulation of intelligence agencies in India. This was something that I fought on behalf of Mr. R.N. Kulkarni, my client, who was an intelligence bureau officer. He was supposed to be with us today for this lecture. He phoned me last week, and I only received news this morning that he was hit by a car in Mysore and passed away. I am gutted because I believe Mr. Kulkarni represented everything that I have spoken about right now. That brutal faith in the Constitution, the conception of an idea of India, the faith to seek justice, liberty, and policy change through courts is what he represented. He was not even a lawyer. And I therefore pay tribute to his memory, and I dedicate today's lecture to the memory of Mr. Kulkarni. This PIL that we fought, friends, with no success, I can tell you, not unsurprisingly, was something we fought to create legitimacy for intelligence agencies in India. You will be surprised to know that the Intelligence Bureau, the RAW, and many other powerful institutions that we hear of have no real mention in our constitution. And we brought a public interest litigation so as to ensure that the courts provide that legitimacy and oversight over these institutions that exercise far-reaching powers, some would say even police powers, though not expressly vested in them. This is something the MI6, the CIA follow. Respectable intelligence agencies all over the world are instituted by legislation, but somehow that gap remains in our constitution. And that's really what I wanted to say to you, that the Indian constitution is far from perfect. There is, of course, a great deal of scope for reform, and I believe this one instance stands out as a glaring shortcoming, if you will, in our constitution. But of course, I'm reminded of what Professor Upendra Bakshi once said to me at a round table some years ago. He said, "There is good life outside the constitution." And certainly so for the political class. I think it was Mr. Pramod Mahajan who once said that the first time most MPs see the constitution is when they take their oath on it. But we ought to necessarily create a greater awareness and engagement with our constitution. Increasingly now, the friction is going to be between that faction of society that believes the constitution must fit its idea of India and the faction that believes its idea of India must fit the constitution. Inevitably, sides will have to be taken. With the emerging access of a cultural revanchism, an autonomous Hindutva, a dominant executive, and a partial media, the Supreme Court and the High Courts are going to find themselves more and more in the eye of a storm. How the courts tackle these vexed issues of socio-cultural and political ramifications within the letter and spirit of the Constitution is going to be critical, friends, to the development, or if you will, the erosion of the idea of India. But that said, there is no institutional alternative in sight. We can't give up. Civil society movements, general awareness of the Constitution, I believe, greater exposure to the Constitution in schools and colleges regardless of curriculum, and greater engagement with this wonderful supreme law of our land in our everyday workplaces and social conversations, I believe will go a long way in refining our understanding of the Constitution, so that when this upcoming cultural collision, if you will, takes place, there is a collective sense of the constitutional idea of India. In his essay, Constitutional Crisis and Constitutional Rot, Jack Balkin says that constitutional rot in a democracy need not always lead to a crisis, but it might simply lead to less just and less democratic systems of government. This is what happens when a democracy becomes an oligarchy or slides into autocracy. Nevertheless, constitutional rot, if unchecked, can lead to a constitutional crisis, just as placing increasing weight on a rotten tree branch can eventually cause it to snap. These are words he says in the context of what he saw with the Trump administration, but I believe that there is a message there. Alok Prasanna, in his recent piece on emergency powers, cites the Constituent Assembly member, Mr. H.V. Kamath, to say, let us remember that the Constitution can be subverted not merely by agitators, rebels and revolutionaries, but also by people in office, by people in power. Dr. Ambedkar had echoed this too. He discarded protest as the grammar of anarchy, but he did say in 1948 that if things go wrong under the new Constitution, the reason will not be that we had a bad Constitution. What we will have to say is man was vile. The onus, therefore, friends, is on us to choose well. That is the idea of a liberal democracy. That is the idea of India. I end with what Khalil Gibran had once said in his poem, Pity the Nation. He said, pity the nation that raises not its voice, save when it walks in a funeral, boasts not except amongst its ruins, and will not react, save when its neck is laid between the sword and the block. May we, friends, collectively preserve our compassion and harmony. May we stand up for our Constitution and its values. May we imagine an India that General Thimayya will be proud of. Thank you. Jai Hind.